Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Ghosts and Spirits video. I thought I would continue with chapter 2 of the book The World's Greatest Ghost by the author Roger Bohr. In this case, he's going to talk about haunted homes. So there's going to be some good sections here dedicated to some of the most well-known and also lesser-known haunted houses, either here in the US or across the world as well. Once again, I'll dedicate this in several parts. This will be part 1, and then I'll focus on each part separately and then give my own thoughts and opinions on it afterward. I've seen some of your comments, by the way, on some of the other parts that I've done from this book, and so far things have been going good. The views have been so-so, but the comments do definitely show some interest, as do the analytics as well. So I thought, why not? Let's go ahead and let's continue here. So again, the theme associated with this chapter is haunted homes. It has the prelude of, from the outside, they look perfectly normal. Nothing strikes the casual visitor as strange, but the people who really know the picturesque castles, stately mansions, and seemingly ordinary houses have different stories to tell. They have experienced the uneasiness of unexplained noises, the shock of inanimate objects flying through the air for no reason, the terror of unreal and unearthly sights. They have experienced a haunted home. Pretty spooky stuff. So let's go ahead and let's start this chapter here. And again, I'll give my thoughts and opinions afterward. So the first segment is called House of Evil. Amityville Jinx hit actor. Actor James Rowland is certain there was an evil jinx on the film The Amityville Horror in which he starred. He played surveyor George Lutz, who, with his family, was driven from his home by a terrifying series of demonic happenings. The film was based on the best-selling book by Jay Anson, to whom the Lutz family told their nightmare story. Rowland said, "On the first day of filming, I stepped into the elevator in my apartment block and pressed the button for the lobby floor. Before we'd gone 3 floors, it shuddered to a grinding, screeching halt. The lights flickered, and I was plunged into frightening darkness. I screamed for help, but nobody could hear me. It was an eerie, frightening experience. You imagine all sorts of hair-raising things in the silent darkness. My pleas bounced back like an echo. Those 30 minutes seemed like an eternity. The jinx hit again the next morning. I'd been on the set less than 1 minute when I tripped over a cable and severely wrenched my ankle," said Rowland. "I hobbled around in pain for days." The film recorded the horrifying events experienced by George and Kathleen Lutz and their 3 children after they moved to Long Island, New York, to a house which had been the scene of a multiple murder in 1974. Ronald Defoe, 23-year-old son of a wealthy car dealer, had drugged his parents, brothers, and sisters at supper, and at 3:15 a.m. he stalked from room to room, shouting or shooting each victim in the back with a rifle. He claimed in court that voices had ordered him to commit the crime. Defoe was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. For the Lutzes, the house's macabre history gave them the chance to buy a dream home at the bargain price of $80,000. Seen in the bright light of day, it was a beautiful 3-story colonial-style residence set on a well-kept lawn which sloped gently down to the bay, and its own boathouse. In the small middle-class community of Amityville, it was a showplace. Soon after the family moved in, they asked the local priest, Father Mancuso, played in the film by Rod Steiger, to bless the house. Author Anson wrote, "The priest entered the house to begin his ritual. When he flicked the first holy water and uttered the words that accompanied the gesture, Father Mancuso heard a masculine voice say with terrible clarity, 'Get out.' He looked up in shock, but he was alone in the room. Who or whatever had spoken was nowhere to be seen. For the first 2 nights in their new home, the Lutzes were awakened by strange noises at 3:15 a.m., but the real horror began on the 3rd night. As usual, George Lutz checked that all the doors and windows were locked before going to bed. The noises roused him again at 3:15, and this time he went out downstairs to investigate. He could not believe what he saw. The heavy solid-wood front door had been wrenched open and was hanging by one hinge. With mounting terror, he realized it had been forced from inside the house. The thick steel doorknob spindle was twisted, and the surrounding metal plate had been forced outwards. From then on, the house seemed to have an evil life of its own. Windows opened and closed at will, and a banister was wrenched from the staircase. 2 weeks after the front door incident, George woke in the night to find his wife Kathleen floating above the bed. George pulled Kathleen down by her hair and switched on the light. He was looking not at his attractive young wife, but at a hideous vision. Kathleen got a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror and screamed, "That's not me, it can't be me." Her appearance changed slowly back to normal over the next 6 hours. A few days later, Kathleen was in the sitting room with George when she looked up and saw two glowing red eyes at the darkened window. She and George hurried outside and found strange tracks in the snow. Kathleen told Anson the prints had been left by cloven hooves like those of an enormous pig. After only 28 days, the Lutzes fled the dream house that had become a nightmare. As they hurriedly gathered a few belongings amid a series of unearthly noises, green slime oozed from the walls and ceiling, and a sticky black substance dripped from the keyholes. Because of the curse, the film men dared not use the actual house. They found an almost identical building in New Jersey. They knew only too well of the frightening things that had happened to people connected with the story. A photographer went to take pictures of Anson immediately after photographing the Amityville house. While he was in the author's home, his car caught fire and billowed orange smoke as it stood empty with the engine switched off. Anson himself told of terrifying events linked with his book. He said, "A woman to whom I loaned some early chapters took the manuscript home. She and two of her children were suffocated in a fire that night. The only item in the apartment that was not damaged by the fire was the manuscript. Another man put the manuscript in the trunk of his car and attempted to drive home. He drove through what he thought was a puddle. It turned out to be a 12-foot deep hole into which his car slid. When the car was fished out the next day, the only dry object in it was the manuscript. And when my editor picked up the completed manuscript at my office, his car caught fire, and he discovered that all the bolts on his engine had been loosened." Anson himself suffered a heart attack, and his son and friend were nearly killed in a car crash. The Lutzes are today alive and well in California and planning another book about their experiences. Their Long Island House of Horrors is now owned by James and Barbara Cromartie. They say the place is not haunted. Whatever the truth, the movie The Amityville Horror will remain a chillingly realistic record of paranormal events. Director Stuart Rosenberg says that he would not have taken on the project if it was just another horror film. He insists, "My first reaction was that it wouldn't be my cup of tea, but I read Jay Anson's book and it had the ring of truth about it." The next segment is called Torment of Calvados. Diaries chart a castle nightmare. Diaries written by a French aristocrat who lived in a gloomy medieval castle set among the apple orchards of Normandy tell the story of one of the most violent hauntings ever recorded. Known simply as X, he recorded in vivid detail the extraordinary events that turned his historic home into a nightmare in the year 1875. They began without warning. Everyone in Calvados Castle had settled down for the night when they were disturbed by ghostly wailing and weeping and rapping on the walls. The noises were heard by the entire household. X himself, his wife, his son's tutor, who was an Abbe, Emily the coachman, and servants August, Emelina, and Selina. After several nights of ever-increasing noise and disturbance, the aristocrat instructed that fine threads were to be strung across every entrance to the castle. He hoped, of course, that in the morning they would be broken, proving that someone had entered and was trying to terrorize them. But the threads remained intact. There was no escaping the fact that the forces existed within the castle walls. On Wednesday, April 13th, 1875, X began keeping a diary. That night, the Abbé was alone in his room when he heard a series of sharp taps on the wall, and a candlestick on the mantelpiece was lifted by an unseen hand. The terror-stricken priest rang for X, who found that not only had the candlestick been moved, but also an armchair which was normally fixed to the floor. For the next 2 days, pounding on the walls, footsteps on the stairs, and other unnerving phenomenon continued unabated. X and the Abbé armed themselves with sticks and searched the castle from top to bottom. They could find no human explanation. By October 31st, the castle was hardly ever at peace. X recorded in his diary, "A very disturbed night. It sounded as if someone went up the stairs with superhuman speed from the ground floor, stamping his feet. Arriving on the landing, he gave 5 heavy blows so strong that objects rattled in their places. Then it seemed as if a heavy anvil or a big log had been thrown at the wall so as to shake the house. Nobody could say where the blows came from, but everyone got up and assembled in the hall. The house only settled down at about 3 in the morning. The following night, everyone was awakened by what sounded like a heavy body rolling downstairs, followed by blows so furious they seemed to rock the house. Over the next few days, the haunting had become so violent the family felt it could not possibly get any worse. But greater ordeals were to come. On the night of November 10th, X wrote in his diary, everyone heard a long shriek and then another as of a woman outside calling for help. At 1:45, we suddenly heard 3 or 4 loud cries in the hall and then on the staircase. Cries, screams, and moans, which sounded like the cries of the damned, seemed to fill the whole castle. Heavy furniture was moved, windows flung open, and more terrifying, Bibles were torn and desecrated. The family began to wonder if the powers of darkness had taken over. X's wife suddenly became the focus of attention. Hearing a noise in the Abbey's room, she crept up the stairs and put out a hand to press down the latch on the door. Before she could touch it, she saw the key turn in the lock, then remove itself, hitting her left hand with a sharp blow. The Abbey, who had run up the stairs after her, saw it happen and afterwards testified that Madame's hand was bruised for 2 days. That night, something hammered on her door so furiously she thought it would break down. The new year brought only fresh terrors to the wretched family. Louder knocking, more persistent voices. The worst day of all was January 26, when the noise was thunderous. It sounded as if demons were driving herds of wild cattle through the rooms. Peals of demonic laughter rang through the ancient walls. The family had had enough. Next day, a priest was called in to exorcise the evil spirit, and the family saw to it that every religious medallion and relic they possessed was placed in full view. The treatment was effective, and at last the hideous uproar ceased. To the family, who believed they would be forced to abandon their home, the peace that followed came as a blessed relief. But the ghostly tormentors of Quevedos had not quite finished. Shortly after the exorcism, all of the religious relics disappeared and could not be found. Then, one morning, as the lady of the house sat writing at her desk, an unseen hand dropped them one by one in front of her. Then there was one short burst of violent sound, and then silence. And then there's a little mini segment called Face in the Floor. One of the world's most puzzling ghost stories began on an afternoon in August 1971 in a cottage in the Spanish village of Belmez near Cordoba in Andalusia. An old woman was busy in the kitchen preparing the evening meal when her grandchild started to scream. The grandmother turned from her oven and saw a tormented face stare up at her from the faded pink tiles of the kitchen floor. When she tried to rub the vision out with a rag, the eyes opened wider, making the expression of the face even more heartrending. The woman sent for the owner of the house. He ripped up the tiles and replaced them with concrete. But 3 weeks later, another face began to form in the new surface, even more clearly defined than the first. The owner called in the authorities, who excavated one section of the floor and what found to be the remains of a medieval burial ground. The floor was repaired, but soon faces started appearing all over the carefully laid concrete. First one, then another, then a whole group. The kitchen was locked and sealed off, but the faces began to appear in other parts of the house. Investigators moved in with ultra-sensitive microphones and picked up agonized moans and voices speaking in a strange language, sounds undetectable to the human ear. But before anyone could discover what they were and why they were there, the faces and sounds just melted away as suddenly, as mysteriously as they had arrived. And then that's it. Let me go ahead and I'll finish it here. And then that way we'll be able to talk about the next part within another chapter here. But otherwise, some pretty good stories and a mini story to include in this discussion. So for starters, let's go ahead and let's talk about the so-called House of Evil, the Amityville horror. So pretty neat coming across this one, because as the theme of the chapter is involving haunted houses, why not start with one of those famous ones? And I just chronicled it within one of my latest 20 things you didn't know about video, right? When it came to that chapter. So quite a coincidence. I had no idea that this was going to be talked about within this book as well. The reason I say so-called is because as my video and then later on proof from others is described, it does seem like much, if not all, or maybe a lot of it, of the story associated with the Amityville horror remains fabricated on the strongest sense or unverified on the loosest sense. Obviously, there's the book, the Amityville horror, and then the film that the book was basically changed into. But here you have a situation where after all these years, so many holes within the stories have been proven. It's hard to tell what's real and what's not. Here, in this case, with this book being created in 1991, The World's Greatest Ghost, it shows information at least from that standpoint. But now, through the passage of time, we've seen that there's a lot that's now untrue. At least here, it was interesting, though, to see what was going on with the actors. James Brolin, he was stating that he was in his elevator at his apartment block, and then all of a sudden it shuddered to a grinding halt, and then clearly there was something happening in the darkness, but he just couldn't make out what it was. And then there was the other horrifying things that were happening to other makers of the film, including, in this case, the author, stating that he had experienced some weird things as far as like a heart attack, and his son, his friend, and the friend of the son also almost being killed in a car crash. And then you had the people handling the manuscripts also having some very bad things happen to them, as far as something happening with their car, and then other things occurring to them at home as well. So again, take that with a grain of salt. Did this really happen? Did it not? It's hard to say. It was also interesting to read that the home was not the actual home in the film. Like, in other words, it was one filmed in New Jersey, of all places. And so interesting to see that they wanted to stay away from the actual home itself. And then the next one involving the Torment of Calvados. I haven't heard of this one, the Calvados Castle. I might have to chronicle that within one of my chapters sometime soon. Here you have a situation where who knows who this entity was, but it was apparently terrorizing this person who only went by the name of X, and him and his family and his servants as well, on a nightly basis almost. And it was getting to an escalating point. And then finally, towards the very end, there was pretty eerie the way it described it, how it was like something that was running super speed up the stairs. That gave me actually the shivers just thinking about it, because that would have been totally, absolutely just purposeful. Like, it would be something that was absolutely just trying to make them so scared, and it was doing a good job. And then on top of that, there was so much knocking, so many voices, and so much laughter, almost as if there was just this demonic laughter ringing through the walls. I would have been gone out of there in no time. They got that thing away, apparently what it was, well, by doing the exorcisms, and then also like having those blessed relics nearby. But ultimately, it decided to make one last visit to let them know that even though it was gone, it pretty much could come back at any point. It was almost like taunting them at that point. And then it did so by dropping those relics out of thin air, who had the ones that had previously gone missing. And then finally, there was that mini segment, the face on the floor. I think I've talked about this one. I remember the faces on the wall, and the Spanish village, the Bellex, kind of sounds familiar, but I'll have to check again. But if not, I might talk about that too. That's pretty eerie too. All of a sudden, there's a face in the tiles looking straight at you. You start moving like a rag over it, thinking that it's some kind of stain, and then the eyes start following you, like it actually opens up even wider. Hell no, I'm gone at that point. That's something where I would be basically going bye-bye to that location and moving out and breaking my lease and so on. But otherwise, I might chronicle that too. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care.